In a dark closet, a pair of prosthetic legs stood gathering dust, worth $40,000, but absolutely nothing to the Marine who refused to put them on. Ethan Vance sat in his wheelchair by the window, a prisoner in his own home, waiting for the end. He thought the war had taken everything from him. But in the pouring rain of a Seattle park, something was crawling toward him. It wasn't a monster from his nightmares. It was a starving, scarred German shepherd who had walked 50 miles on bleeding paws just to find the one man who could save him. No one knew the dog's name. No one knew his secret. But when he rested his head on Ethan's empty lap, he didn't just ask for help. He offered a reason to live. What happens next will heal your heart and prove that broken things are often the strongest. Before we start, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. And if you believe that sometimes the hero we need is the one we rescue, hit that subscribe button, because this story is going to change the way you look at loyalty forever. The rain in Seattle was less of a weather event and more of a state of being. It didn't fall so much as it hung in the air, a gray, wet curtain that wrapped itself around the city of emerald hills and steel towers. It was early November, and the sky above the Space Needle was a bruised purple-gray, threatening a downpour that never quite committed, settling instead for a bone-chilling drizzle that seeped into the cracks of the pavement and the joints of old men. Inside the dim bedroom of a small suburban house in the Queen Anne district, the gloom outside felt like a reflection of the world inside. Ethan Echo Vance sat on the edge of his bed. He was 32 years old, with the broad shoulders and thick neck of a man built for combat, but his posture was slumped, collapsing inward like a building with a compromised foundation. His hair, once a high and tight military cut, had grown out just enough to look neglected, dark strands falling over eyes that were the color of storm clouds, blue, gray, and turbulent. He wasn't looking at the window. He was staring at the closet door, which was left slightly ajar. Inside, gleaming faintly in the shadows, stood a pair of prosthetic legs. They were marvels of modern engineering, carbon fiber and titanium, designed to give a man back his mobility. But to Ethan, they looked like expensive lies. They were plastic and metal skeletons that promised a freedom he didn't feel he deserved. They had been sitting there for 3 years, gathering a fine layer of dust, standing at attention while the man they were made for refused to acknowledge them. To put them on was to admit that his real legs were gone. To leave them there was to remain in limbo. Ethan chose limbo. Ethan? The soft knock on the doorframe broke the silence. Robert Vance stood in the doorway. At 65, Robert was a man carved from patience and oak. He had thinning gray hair combed neatly to the side and wore a beige cardigan that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and old books. His face was lined with the specific kind of wrinkles that come from worrying about someone else for too long. "It's 2 o'clock, son," Robert said gently. "The rain's let up a bit. Let's get some air." Ethan didn't answer immediately. He reached for the wheels of his chair, his knuckles white as he gripped the rims. "It's cold out, Dad." "It's Seattle. It's always cold," Robert countered with a small, sad smile. He walked over, grabbed a thick wool blanket from the foot of the bed, and waited. He didn't offer to lift Ethan. He knew the boundaries of his son's pride. Ethan maneuvered his body into the wheelchair with a grunt of exertion, his biceps flexing under his t-shirt. It was a fluid motion, practiced 1,000 times, but it ended with him settling heavily into the seat, a visual confirmation of his confinement. Robert tucked the blanket around Ethan's waist, covering the empty space where his legs used to be, hiding the physical truth of the war that had followed him home. "All right," Ethan muttered. "Let's go." The park was awash of muted greens and browns. Wet leaves plastered the walking path like a mosaic of decay. The air smelled of wet earth and pine needles, a scent that was usually refreshing, but today just felt damp and heavy. Robert pushed the wheelchair at a steady, rhythmic pace. He wasn't a frail man, but the hills of the park required effort. He breathed steadily, his shoes crunching on the gravel. "I saw the Seahawks are playing the 49ers this weekend," Robert said, his voice a little too bright, trying to puncture the bubble of silence surrounding his son. "I was thinking we could order some wings. Maybe get that spicy sauce you used to like." Ethan stared straight ahead, watching the path unwind before him. "Sure, Dad. Whatever." "And Mrs. Higgins next door asked about you," Robert continued, undeterred. "She made that apple pie again. Said she left a slice on the porch for us." "That's nice of her." Ethan's voice was flat. a monotone frequency that offered no emotional foothold. Robert felt a pang of despair tighten his chest. He looked down at the top of his son's head. He remembered a different Ethan. He remembered the boy who was captain of the varsity football team, the young man who had run up these very hills with a laugh that could startle the birds. He remembered the Marine who had stood tall in his dress blues, chest swelling with purpose before he deployed. That man seemed to have died in the Helmand province, leaving behind this ghost who lived in a wheelchair and stared at the rain. The IEED hadn't just taken Ethan's legs, it had taken his spirit, leaving a hollow space that no amount of therapy or fatherly love seemed able to fill. "Ethan, Robert started, then stopped. He didn't know what to say anymore. "I miss you. I love you. Please come back to me." They reached a secluded section of the park, near a grove of ancient oak trees that blocked out the gray skyline. The path here was cracked, roots pushing up through the asphalt. It was quiet, the city noise muffled by the dense canopy. Robert slowed the wheelchair to a stop. "Let's take a breather here. The view of the lake is nice through the trees." Ethan didn't argue. He just sat, gripping the armrests, his eyes unfocused. "Dad?" Ethan asked suddenly, his voice tight. "Yeah, son? Do you think it ever stops?" "What?" "The noise. In my head." Robert walked around to the front of the chair and crouched down, his knees popping. He looked into his son's haunted eyes. "I don't know, Ethan, but I know you don't have to carry it alone." Ethan looked away, shame coloring his cheeks. He opened his mouth to speak, but a movement in the periphery caught his eye. Robert saw it too. He stood up and squinted into the shadows beneath the largest oak tree. What in the world? Huddled against the gnarled roots of the tree, trying to find shelter from the dripping branches, was a shape. It was a mass of wet fur, black and tan, blending almost perfectly with the gloom. "Is that a dog?" Robert asked, stepping closer. The creature lifted its head. It was a German shepherd, or at least the skeleton of one. Its ribs were visible through its soaked coat, rising and falling with shallow, shivering breaths. One of its ears was notched, and there was a jagged scar running down its flank, pink and angry against the dark fur. It looked miserable, abandoned, and utterly defeated. "Poor thing," Robert whispered. "He looks like he's starving." The dog's ears twitched at the sound of the voice. It shifted, trying to stand, but its back legs seemed weak. It collapsed back onto the wet leaves, letting out a low, mournful whine. Ethan turned his head slowly. He didn't want to look. He didn't want to see another broken thing in a world full of them. But he couldn't help it. His gaze locked onto the dog. For a second, time didn't just stop. It shattered. The dog's eyes were a rich, intelligent amber. They weren't the eyes of a wild animal. They were eyes that held a depth of sorrow and recognition that hit Ethan like a physical blow. Flash, sand, blinding white heat, the smell of burning rubber, and copper blood. The weight of a heavy body pressing him down into the dirt. A wet tongue on his face. A final sharp yelp. "No!" Ethan gasped. The air left his lungs. The park vanished. The rain turned into falling ash. The wet leaves turned into blood-soaked sand. "No, no, no!" Ethan screamed, the sound tearing out of his throat, raw and terrified. He slammed his hands against the wheels of his chair, frantically trying to back away. "Get back! Get it away! Incoming! Incoming!" Ethan, it's just a dog!" Robert shouted, grabbing the handles of the wheelchair to stop it from tipping over into the mud. "It's okay. You're in Seattle. You're safe." But Ethan wasn't safe. He was back in the kill zone, his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, beating so hard it hurt. He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking violently, waiting for the explosion. But the explosion didn't come. Instead, he heard a sound, not a growl, not a bark, a soft, rhythmic rustling of leaves. Ethan opened his eyes, his breath coming in jagged, panic-stricken gasps. The dog was moving. It hadn't run away at his screaming. It hadn't growled in defense. It was crawling. The German shepherd had lowered its belly to the muddy ground. It was pulling itself forward with its front paws, dragging its back legs slightly, keeping its head low in a posture of absolute submission. It wasn't attacking. It was approaching him the way a soldier approaches a wounded comrade, carefully, reverently. Robert stood frozen, his hands hovering over his son's shoulders, watching in disbelief. The dog reached the foot of the wheelchair. It paused, looking up at Ethan with those soulful amber eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 years of loyalty. It was shivering from the cold, but its gaze was steady. Slowly, ever so slowly, the dog lifted its chin. It rested its heavy, wet head gently on the wool blanket, right over the spot where Ethan's legs ended. The weight was real. It was grounding. It was a warm, living anchor in the middle of Ethan's storm. The flashback flickered and died. The sand faded back into wet grass. The smell of burning rubber was replaced by the smell of wet fur and rain. Ethan stopped shaking. His hands, which had been raised to protect his face, slowly lowered. He stared at the dog's head resting on his stumps. The dog let out a long sigh, closing its eyes, as if it had finally found the only safe place in the world. Ethan reached out. His hand trembled uncontrollably. He hesitated, his fingers hovering inches from the dog's soaked head. The dog didn't flinch. It just leaned into the warmth of Ethan's body. Ethan's fingers brushed the wet fur. He traced the shape of the dog's skull. He felt the familiar ridge of bone between the ears. Tears, hot and fast, spilled over Ethan's eyelids, mixing with the rain on his cheeks. He choked on a sob, a sound of heartbreak and disbelief. "Gunner?" he whispered, his voice broken, a tiny sound in the vast gray afternoon. Is that you, buddy? You came back?" The dog didn't answer, but it pressed its head harder against Ethan, offering the only thing it had left to give, its presence. The drive home was a silent affair, punctuated only by the rhythmic thwack hiss of the windshield wipers battling the relentless Seattle drizzle. The back of Robert's station wagon, usually pristine, now smelled intensely of wet earth and damp fur. Ranger, as Robert had decided to call him on the walk back to the car, sat in the back seat with a stoic dignity that belied his ragged appearance. He didn't pace, whine, or claw at the windows like a typical stray. Instead, he sat perfectly upright, his amber eyes fixed on the back of Ethan's headrest, watching the man in the passenger seat with an intensity that felt less like curiosity and more like guard duty. Ethan stared out the window, watching the gray blur of the city roll by. He felt raw, his skin too tight for his body. The moment in the park, the touch of the wet fur, the whispered name, felt like a hallucination now. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a cold, hard knot of regret in his stomach. "He needs a bath," Robert said, breaking the silence as they pulled into the driveway of their craftsman-style home. "And a good meal. I think we have some leftover roast chicken." "He shouldn't stay, Dad," Ethan said, his voice raspy. He didn't look back at the dog. "We don't know where he came from. He could be sick. He could be dangerous." "He looks about as dangerous as a wet sock, Ethan," Robert replied gently, turning off the engine. "Besides, look at him. He chose you." Ethan flinched. That was exactly the problem. Getting Ranger inside revealed another layer of the mystery. As soon as Robert opened the front door, Ranger didn't bolt inside, seeking warmth. He waited. He stood at the threshold, trembling slightly from the cold, looking from Robert to Ethan, waiting for a cue. "Come on in, buddy," Robert coaxed. Ranger stepped in gingerly, his claws clicking softly on the hardwood floor. But instead of running to the fireplace, he immediately began a perimeter sweep. He moved efficiently through the living room, sniffing the corners, checking behind the sofa, his ears swiveling like radar dishes. Once satisfied the room was secure, he returned to Ethan. He didn't nudge for attention. He didn't beg. He simply walked to the left side of Ethan's wheelchair, the military heel position, and sat down, his shoulder brushing against the rubber wheel. Ethan looked down at the dog, his jaw tightening. The positioning was too perfect. The discipline was too familiar. It was a mirror, reflecting a past he was desperately trying to outrun. "Get away," Ethan muttered, but there was no heat in the command. He spun his wheels, maneuvering toward the kitchen. Ranger stood up instantly and followed, matching Ethan's pace exactly. When Ethan stopped at the fridge, Ranger stopped. When Ethan turned, Ranger turned. He was a shadow, tethered not by a leash, but by an invisible instinct. "He's a smart one," Robert observed, setting a bowl of shredded chicken and water on the floor. "Look at that focus." Ranger looked at the food, drool gathering at the corner of his mouth, his ribs heaving with hunger. Yet, he didn't eat. He looked up at Ethan, his body rigid. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut. He knew what the dog was waiting for, a release command. "Eat," Ethan whispered, the words slipping out before he could stop it. Ranger immediately lowered his head and began to eat, not with ravenous chaos, but with swift, efficient bites. Later that evening, the house settled into a heavy quiet. Robert had set up a makeshift bed for Ranger in the corner of the living room, with old blankets, but as soon as the lights went out, the clicking of claws could be heard moving down the hallway. Ethan lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling. The prosthetic legs were still in the closet, the door shut tight. He could hear the rain drumming on the roof, a sound that usually lulled him to sleep but tonight sounded like static in a radio headset. He heard a soft huff of breath near his doorway. He knew Ranger was there. "Go away," Ethan whispered into the darkness. "You don't want to be near me." He truly believed it. He felt like a walking nexus of bad luck. Everyone he got close to ended up hurt. His mother had died of cancer while he was in boot camp. Gunnar had died protecting him. His own legs had been taken as payment for a war he couldn't win. He was cursed, a black hole that swallowed light and happiness. If he let this dog in, if he let himself care, the universe would find a way to take Ranger too. It was safer to be alone, safer for everyone. Ranger didn't leave. He circled 3 times on the rug beside the bed and settled down with a heavy sigh, a sentinel in the dark. Ethan eventually drifted into a restless, shallow sleep. The dream didn't start with images. It started with sound. The thud-thud-thud of rotor blades chopping the air. The static hiss of the radio. Echo 2-1, advise status. Then came the heat. It wasn't the damp chill of Seattle. It was the suffocating, dry heat of the Helmand Desert. Ethan was walking on patrol, the gravel crunching under his boots. Gunnar was 10 feet ahead, tail high, testing the air. "Watch your 6, Sergeant," a voice said. Ethan turned, and suddenly the ground beneath him turned to liquid fire. The explosion wasn't a noise, it was a physical force that tore the world apart. He was flying, weightless, surrounded by a cloud of red mist and black smoke. He hit the ground hard, the air driven from his lungs. He tried to stand, but he couldn't feel the earth beneath his feet. He looked down. His legs were gone. In their place was only ruin. And Gunnar wasn't moving. "Gunnar!" Ethan screamed in the dream, but no sound came out. His throat was filled with sand. "Gunnar, get up! That's an order! Get up!" The sand began to rise around him, burying him. He was drowning in the desert. The darkness was closing in, a heavy, suffocating blanket. He couldn't breathe. His heart was hammering so hard he thought his ribs would crack. "No, no, stay with me!" In the real world, Ethan was thrashing in his sheets. A guttural, animalistic howl tore from his throat, echoing through the silent house. Down the hall, Robert woke with a start. "Ethan!" he shouted, throwing off his covers and scrambling for his cane. He moved as fast as his aging hips would allow, his heart racing with the terrifying familiarity of the sound. He had heard these night terrors before, but this one sounded different, more desperate, more raw. Robert reached Ethan's door, breathless, his hand fumbling for the light switch, but before he could flick it, he froze. In the dim light filtering in from the street lamp outside, Robert saw a silhouette on the bed. Ethan was still screaming, his hands clawing at the air, fighting off invisible ghosts. "Incoming! Get down! Gunnar!" Ranger didn't bark. He didn't panic. With a fluid, practiced motion, the German Shepherd climbed onto the bed. He didn't jump. He crawled, heavy and low. He moved directly over Ethan's thrashing chest. Ranger lowered his full weight onto Ethan, pressing him down into the mattress. It was a technique known as deep pressure therapy, using weight to ground a person, to force their nervous system to switch from fight or flight back to reality. Ethan gasped, the sudden weight on his chest shocking him. He tried to push the dog off, his hands striking Ranger's shoulders in his panic. Get off me!" Ranger didn't budge. He took the hits without flinching. He pressed his face close to Ethan's, his warm breath washing over the man's tear-streaked cheeks. Then Ranger began to lick Ethan's face. Long, rough, rhythmic strokes, from the chin to the forehead, over and over, a relentless assault of affection. "Stop! Stop!" Ethan's voice cracked, transitioning from a scream to a sob. The weight was real. The heat was real. The smell of the dog, earthy and alive, cut through the smell of blood and smoke in his mind. "You're okay," the weight seemed to say. "You're here, not there." Ethan's eyes flew open. He wasn't in the desert. He was in his room. The ceiling fan was spinning slowly above him. And on top of him, staring down with eyes full of infinite patience, was Ranger. Ethan's hands, which had been pushing the dog away, slowly lost their tension. They trembled in the air for a moment, suspended between fear and need. Then they collapsed. Ethan wrapped his arms around Ranger's neck, burying his face in the coarse fur. "I'm sorry," Ethan sobbed, his body shaking with the force of his release. "I'm so sorry, Gunner. I'm sorry." Ranger rested his chin on Ethan's shoulder and let out a long, soft exhale, closing his eyes. He absorbed the tremors of the weeping man, holding him together when he felt like he was falling apart. In the doorway, Robert lowered his hand from the light switch. He stepped back into the shadows, tears streaming silently down his own face. He knew, in that moment, that he wasn't just watching a dog comfort a man. He was watching a lifeline being thrown into the abyss. The waiting room of the Emerald City Veterinary Clinic smelled of antiseptic, nervous sweat, and wet fur. It was a sterile, fluorescent-lit purgatory that Ethan Vance hated immediately. He sat in his wheelchair in the far corner, his back pressed against the wall, pulling the brim of his baseball cap low to shield his eyes from the pitying glances of a woman with a shivering chihuahua. Ranger sat beside the left wheel, a statue carved from obsidian and anxiety. The dog wasn't relaxed. His ears swiveled like radar dishes, tracking every door opening, every whimper from another animal, every footstep. He wasn't aggressive, but he was undeniably ready. "He's making people nervous," Ethan muttered, keeping his voice low. "Look at him. He looks like he's guarding the perimeter." "He's guarding you, Ethan," Robert said softly, flipping through an old magazine without reading a word. "There's a difference." The door to the exam rooms opened, and a woman in blue scrubs stepped out. Dr. Sarah Jenkins was a woman who radiated competence the way a heater radiates warmth. In her late 40s, she had messy blonde hair tied back in a practical bun, and eyes that had seen everything from birthed calves to euthanized hamsters. She didn't look at the wheelchair first. She looked at the dog. "Vance party," she called out, her voice raspy and kind. Ethan wheeled himself forward, Ranger matching his pace perfectly. As they entered the exam room, Sarah raised an eyebrow. "That's some serious healing," she noted. "I usually have to wrestle German shepherds onto the scale. This one moves like he's on a drill deck." "He just showed up like this," Robert explained, closing the door behind them. "Found him in the park yesterday." Sarah knelt down, ignoring the mud that still clung to Ranger's paws, despite Robert's best efforts to clean him up. She offered the back of her hand for Ranger to sniff. Ranger gave it a perfunctory sniff, accepted her presence as non-hostile, and allowed her to run her hands over his ribs. "He's severely underweight," Sarah murmured, her hands moving professionally over the dog's flank. "Dehydrated. Coat is rough." She paused, her fingers tracing a line of raised, hairless skin along Ranger's neck and shoulder. "And he has been in a fight, recently." Ethan looked closer. He hadn't noticed the scars under the wet fur in the dark of the park. Now, under the harsh clinic lights, they were undeniable, jagged, ugly pink lines that spoke of violence. "Bite marks?" Ethan asked, his voice tight. "Defensive wounds," Sarah corrected. "See how they're mostly on his shoulders and neck? He was protecting his throat. Someone, or something, came at him hard." She stood up and grabbed a scanner from the counter. "Let's see if he has a name." She ran the device over Ranger's shoulder blades. A sharp beep echoed in the small room. Sarah looked at the readout, and her brow furrowed. She tapped the screen, frowning. "That's odd." "What is it?" Robert asked, leaning forward on his cane. "This isn't a standard civilian microchip," Sarah said, walking over to her computer. "It's encrypted, 15-digit ISO, but the manufacturer code is restricted." She began typing rapidly. "I need to access the National Working Dog Registry. Give me a moment." While Sarah typed, Robert motioned for Ethan to hold Ranger still, though the dog hadn't moved a muscle. Robert stepped closer to the counter, lowering his voice so only the doctor could hear. "Sarah," Robert whispered, his voice trembling slightly, "please, whatever you find, tell me there's hope for this dog." Sarah stopped typing for a second, looking at Robert. "He's in rough shape, Bob. Why is this so important?" Robert glanced back at his son. Ethan was absent-mindedly stroking Ranger's scarred neck, his expression softer than it had been in 3 years. "Because I'm losing him," Robert choked out, the confession barely audible. "My son. He's drowning, Sarah. He sits in that room with the shades drawn and waits to die. This dog is the first thing that's made him cry. It's the first time he's come out of that house without me forcing him. If this dog has to go, I don't think Ethan will survive it." Sarah's expression softened. She looked from the desperate father to the broken soldier and the scarred dog. She turned back to the screen, her resolve hardening. "Let's see who you are, buddy." A moment later, a file popped up on the screen. Sarah gasped softly. "Well," she said, turning her chair around to face them, "this explains the discipline." "What is it?" Ethan asked, sensing the shift in the room's energy. "His name isn't Ranger," Sarah said, looking at the file. "Technically, it's Canine Echo 7, but the file says his handler called him Ranger. He was born at the Naval Base San Diego Canine Training Center." Ethan's head snapped up. "San Diego? That's where I deployed from. But how did he get here? That's over 1,000 miles away." Sarah read further, her face darkening. "He was listed as stolen 6 months ago. A van transporting washouts, dogs that were physically perfect but too gentle for attack work, was hijacked. Authorities suspected a ring of illegal dogfighting organizers. They steal strong breeds, hoping to force them to fight." Ethan felt a cold rage simulate the ice in his veins. He looked at the scars on Ranger's neck. They tried to make him a killer. "And he refused," Sarah said, piecing the story together from the vet notes in the system. "The report says the transport truck was found abandoned at a truck stop near Tacoma, Washington, 2 weeks ago. Cages were chewed through, wire mesh ripped apart. Several dogs were missing. Ranger didn't just escape, Ethan. He broke out." "He chewed through metal?" Robert asked, astonished. "He fought his way out," Ethan corrected, his eyes locked on the dog. "He fought the other dogs, he fought the cage, and he ran. He must have traveled 50 miles on foot to get to Seattle," Sarah added. "Hungry, wounded, and alone." Ethan looked at Ranger. The dog looked back, his amber eyes clear and unblinking. He wasn't a victim, he was a survivor. He had been taken, tortured, and thrown into a pit, but he had kept his soul intact. He had walked through hell to find a safe harbor. "There's one more thing," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper. She hesitated, knowing the weight of what she was about to say. "Ethan, the database lists lineage, sire and dam." Ethan held his breath. "His mother was a Belgian Malinois named Bella," Sarah read, "and his father was a German Shepherd, service number K9404, call sign, Gunner." The silence in the room was absolute. The hum of the computer fan seemed to roar. Ethan felt like he had been punched in the chest, but this time it wasn't painful. It was the shock of a heart restarting. "Gunner," Ethan whispered. The name tasted like sand and blood, but now it also tasted like hope. "He's Gunner's son." "The timing fits," Sarah said gently. "Gunner was bred just before his final deployment. This is his litter." Ethan wheeled his chair closer to Ranger. He reached out, his hand trembling, but this time he didn't pull back. He ran his fingers over the jagged scar on Ranger's shoulder, the defensive wound where he had fought off the monsters who wanted to turn him into a beast. Ethan looked down at his own legs, or where they should have been. He thought of the scars that crisscrossed his own mind, the defensive wounds of his soul. "You and me, buddy," Ethan murmured, his voice thick with tears. "We both walked out of the fire, didn't we?" Ranger leaned his head forward and licked the tears from Ethan's cheek, just once. A confirmation. Ethan looked up at Sarah, his eyes fierce and bright for the first time in years. The gray fog was gone. "He's not going back," Ethan said. It wasn't a request, it was an order. "He's not going to a shelter. He's not going back to the Navy. He's staying with me." "He's legally property of the U.S. government, Ethan," Sarah warned gently, though a smile played on her lips. "It could be a fight." "I'm a Marine," Ethan said, straightening his spine, his hand resting firmly on Ranger's head. "I know how to fight. Dad said he needs a home. Well, he found one. No one touches him. I promise you," he looked down at the dog, "I won't let anyone hurt you again." Robert stood in the corner, clutching his cane, weeping silently. He had walked into the clinic with a broken son and a stray dog. He was leaving with 2 soldiers who had finally found their platoon. The gloom that had suffocated the Vance household for 3 years didn't vanish overnight, but it began to retreat, pushed back by the clicking of claws on hardwood and the sharp, clear whistle of commands. For the first time in forever, the curtains in the living room were drawn open. The November sun, usually a shy visitor in Seattle, pierced through the clouds, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny stars. In the backyard, the grass was wet and long, but it was no longer a neglected patch of earth. It had become a training ground. Ethan Vance sat in his wheelchair, but he didn't look like the ghost who had haunted the hallway just a week ago. The transformation was physical and striking. The shaggy, unkempt beard was gone, replaced by a clean shave that revealed the sharp, determined line of his jaw. His hair was cut high and tight, a Marine Corps standard that spoke of discipline and readiness. He wore a gray hoodie with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms that were regaining their definition. "Ranger, heel!" Ethan commanded. His voice had lost its rasp. It was firm, projecting from the diaphragm. Ranger moved like liquid shadow. He didn't just walk beside the chair, he flowed with it. When Ethan turned the left wheel to pivot, Ranger stepped backward in perfect synchronization, ensuring he never crossed the path of the rubber tire. "Good boy," Ethan praised, reaching into a pouch tied to his armrest to toss a piece of dried liver. Ranger caught it midair with a snap, his tail giving a single, satisfied thump against the grass. Inside the kitchen, Robert Vance stood by the sink, a coffee mug forgotten in his hand. He watched through the window, afraid to move, afraid to break the spell. He saw something he hadn't seen since before the deployment. Ethan was smiling. It wasn't a big smile, just a subtle quirk of the lips, but to Robert, it was like witnessing a sunrise after a polar night. "He's coming back, Mary," Robert whispered to the empty room, speaking to his late wife. "He's finally coming back." Later that afternoon, the training moved to more practical matters. Ethan had rigged a piece of rope to the front axle of his wheelchair. "Ranger, tug," Ethan said, pointing to the rope. Ranger gripped the knot in his jaws and pulled. He didn't yank. He leaned his weight into it, his back paws digging into the carpet, providing the extra momentum Ethan needed to get over the slight lip of the doorway that always frustrated him. "Easy, halt," Ethan said. Ranger stopped instantly, releasing the rope. "You're turning him into a sled dog," Robert joked, walking into the living room with a basket of laundry. "I'm turning him into my legs, Dad," Ethan corrected, though his tone was light. He looked down at Ranger. "Since the metal ones in the closet don't have a heartbeat," Robert's smile faltered slightly. He glanced toward the hallway where the prosthetics were stored. "Dr. Jenkins said you're strong." "Enough now, Ethan. With Ranger's help, you could probably—" "No," Ethan cut him off. The softness vanished from his eyes, replaced by a sudden wall of ice. "We're not doing that. Ranger is all I need. He doesn't chafe, he doesn't look like a robot, and he doesn't remind me of what I lost." He whistled sharply. "Ranger, fetch! Remote!" Ranger trotted to the coffee table, picked up the TV remote gently in his mouth, being careful not to press any buttons with his teeth, and placed it in Ethan's outstretched hand. "See," Ethan said, challenging his father. "Functioning perfectly." Robert nodded, wise enough not to push. The healing was happening, but the scar tissue was still tender. 2 days later, Ethan decided they were ready for field ops. Behind their neighborhood lay a stretch of undeveloped land, a mix of prairie forest and rocky trails that eventually led down to the Puget Sound. It wasn't wheelchair-friendly, but Ethan was feeling invincible. The bond with Ranger had given him a surge of dopamine that masked the limitations of his reality. "Are you sure about this route?" Robert asked, eyeing the muddy path that wound between 2 large fir trees. He was walking a few paces behind, carrying a backpack with water and a first aid kit. "I need to know what we can handle," Ethan grunted, pushing his rims hard. The muscles in his shoulders burned, a good, clean pain. "If I'm going to start living again, I can't stick to the sidewalks." Ranger trotted ahead, scouting. Every few yards, he would stop, look back to check Ethan's progress, and then continue. He seemed to understand that the terrain was the enemy here. The trouble started with a deceptive patch of moss. Ethan was navigating a slight decline. He saw a large root protruding from the earth, and angled his chair to straddle it. But as he corrected his course, his left wheel hit a slick patch of mud hidden under damp pine needles. The wheel lost traction. The chair skidded sideways, the momentum carrying it toward a shallow ditch. "Ethan!" Robert shouted, lunging forward. It happened in slow motion. The heavy wheelchair tipped, gravity took over. Ethan was thrown from the seat, his body twisting in the air before he slammed face first into the wet, cold mud of the ditch. The wheelchair crashed down beside him, one wheel spinning lazily in the air. Pain flared in Ethan's shoulder and cheekbone. The breath was knocked out of him. For a moment, all he could smell was wet dirt and decaying leaves, the smell of the ground, the smell of being fallen. "I've got you! I'm coming!" Robert cried, scrambling down the slope, his face pale with panic. "Stop!" Ethan roared. The command was so loud it startled the crows from the trees. Robert froze, one foot in the ditch. "Ethan, you're hurt. Let me help you." "No!" Ethan pushed himself up onto his elbows, spitting mud. His face was streaked with dirt, his eyes blazing with humiliation and fury. "Don't touch me. I have to do this. If I can't get up, then I'm just a cripple in a chair." He wasn't yelling at his father. He was yelling at the universe. He was yelling at the IEED Ranger was there instantly. He hadn't barked. He was standing right beside Ethan in the mud, whining softly, his nose nudging Ethan's ear. He was vibrating with the urge to help, but waiting for direction. Ethan gritted his teeth. He tried to push himself up, but the mud was slippery. His center of gravity was gone without his legs. Every time he pushed, his hands slid, and he flopped back down. He felt a tear of frustration mix with the mud on his face. He looked at the overturned wheelchair. It looked like a dead beetle. It was too far to reach. He looked at Ranger. The dog stood firm, his paws planted deep in the earth, his body a solid wedge of muscle. Ethan remembered the training manuals he had read late at night. Service dogs weren't just for comfort. They were tools. They were leverage. "Ranger," Ethan gasped, wiping his eyes with a muddy forearm. He locked eyes with the dog. "Here." Ranger stepped closer, positioning himself broadside to Ethan, his body rigid, bracing his legs. "Ranger, brace!" It was a new command, one they had only practiced in the living room on the carpet, but Ranger didn't hesitate. He locked his elbows. He lowered his head slightly, tensing his shoulders to take the weight. He became a living statue. Ethan reached out. He placed one hand on Ranger's sturdy shoulder blades and the other on the dog's hip. "Steady," Ethan whispered. He pushed down. Ranger grunted softly with the effort, his paws sinking an inch deeper into the mud. But he didn't buckle. He held the weight of the man who loved him. He was the anchor. Ethan used the dog as a fulcrum. He engaged his triceps, his core, and his spirit. He pivoted his torso, swinging his hips around until he was sitting upright on the ground. He paused, panting, his hands still resting on Ranger's back. He was covered in muck. He was bruised, but he was sitting up. "Good boy," Ethan breathed, his voice trembling. "Good boy." From there, he was able to reach the wheelchair. With a grunt of exertion, he hauled the chair upright. Then, using Ranger's back for balance one last time, he hoisted his body back into the seat. Robert stood on the trail, his hands covering his mouth, tears standing in his eyes. He hadn't moved. He had watched his son fall, and he had watched his son rise. Ethan sat there for a moment, adjusting his muddy hoodie. He looked at his hands, coated in the earth of the trail. Then he looked at Ranger, whose side was also muddy from where Ethan had grabbed him. Ethan looked up at his father. "We're going to need a hose when we get back." Robert let out a wet, shaky laugh. Yeah, I think we will." Ethan patted his leg, and Ranger immediately returned to the heel position, muddy and proud. "Let's finish the walk," Ethan said. The package arrived on a Thursday, carried to the porch by a delivery driver who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else but under the gray, leaking sky of Seattle. It was a cardboard box, taped shut with excessive layers of packing tape, the corners battered from a long journey. The return address was a P.O. box in San Diego, labeled simply, Estate of Master Sergeant Thomas Miller. Robert Vance brought it inside, wiping the rain from the cardboard with a kitchen towel. "Ethan," he called out, his voice competing with the wind whistling through the eaves. "Something for you." Ethan wheeled into the living room, Ranger trotting silently at his left. Ranger's ears were pinned back, his body tense. Animals always knew when the weather was turning, before the humans did. The barometer was dropping fast, and the air felt heavy, charged with static electricity. Ethan took the box. He didn't recognize the name on the label immediately, but he recognized the rank. Master Sergeant Miller, Mac, the head trainer at the K-9 Center, the man who had handed Gunner's leash to Ethan for the first time. "He passed away last month," Ethan said quietly, staring at the label. "Heart attack." He used a pocket knife to slit the tape. Inside, nestled in packing peanuts, was a leather-bound logbook, an old chew toy that looked like it had survived a war, and a sealed white envelope. Ethan opened the logbook first. It was Gunner's training record. Every drill, every milestone, every deployment note, written in Mac's neat, blocky handwriting. Ethan ran his thumb over the pages, feeling the ghost of his partner in the ink. Then he reached for the envelope. On the front, in shaky cursive, was written, "For Sergeant Vance. Open when you're ready." Robert sat on the sofa, giving his son space, pretending to watch the weather report on the mute TV. The weatherman was gesturing wildly at a swirling vortex of red and orange off the coast. Ethan broke the seal. The letter was dated 2 weeks before Mac's death. "Dear Ethan, if you're reading this, I've gone to the big kennel in the sky. I hope they have decent whiskey there. I'm writing because I have a confession to make and a debt to pay. You remember Gunner? Best damn dog I ever trained. Too smart for his own good, just like his handler. Before you two shipped out for that last tour, I did something I wasn't supposed to. I bred him. I broke protocol, son. Canines aren't supposed to sire litters while active, but I had a feeling. Call it an old man's intuition, or maybe I just saw the way you two looked at each other before you got on that bird. I knew Gunner might not come back, and I knew if he didn't, a part of you wouldn't come back either. So I kept a pup, the pick of the litter. He had his father's eyes and his mother's stubborn streak. I named him Ranger, but on the paperwork, he's Echo 7. I trained him myself, off the books, on weekends. I didn't train him to be an attack dog. Ethan, I trained him to be a shadow, to watch, to wait, to hold the line when the world gets too heavy. I arranged for him to be sent to you when he was ready, but then those bastards hijacked the transport. I spent my last few months trying to find him. I died thinking I failed you, but if my gut is right, and it usually is, he'll find you. He's got Gunner's compass in his blood. When he does, don't look at him as a replacement. You can't replace a soul like Gunner. Look at him as a teammate. Gunner saved your life. Ranger is there to help you live it. Stand tall, Marine. Mac. Ethan lowered the paper. His hands were shaking, but not from PTSD. It was the vibration of a profound, overwhelming gratitude. He looked down at Ranger. The dog was sitting by the wheel, his head resting on Ethan's knee, watching him with those amber eyes that held the wisdom of 2 generations. He knew, Ethan whispered, his voice thick. He planned it all. Robert leaned forward. What is it, son? Ethan handed the letter to his father. As Robert read, tears welled in his eyes, tracking through the deep lines of his face. A letter from the grave, Robert murmured. My God. It wasn't an accident, Ethan. None of this was an accident. Just then the house groaned. It wasn't a subtle creak. It was a deep structural moan, like the wooden bones of the building were being compressed. The wind outside had shifted from a whistle to a roar. Rain lashed against the window pane with the force of gravel. The forecast changed, Robert said, looking at the TV. The banner at the bottom flashed red. Extreme weather warning. Atmospheric river stalling over King County. Flash flood and landslide risk critical. That's not just rain, Ethan said, his military instincts snapping into place. He tucked the letter safely into his pocket. That's a deluge. The ground is already saturated from last week. If this keeps up... The hill behind us, Robert finished the thought, his face paling. The retaining wall is old. We need to secure the house, Ethan commanded. Dad, get the plywood for the lower windows facing the slope. I'll check the perimeter and get the emergency kit. For the next hour, the Vance household became a forward operating base. The emotional tenderness of the letter was packed away, replaced by focused action. Ethan moved through the house with Ranger glued to his side. He filled the bathtub with water, checked the batteries in the flashlights, and staged MREs, meals ready to eat, on the kitchen counter. Ranger paced, whining low in his throat, stopping occasionally to press his side against Ethan's legs, seeking reassurance. Easy, buddy, Ethan soothed, scratching behind Ranger's ears. We're holding the line. Robert was in the garage, searching for the hammer and nails. He was moving with a frantic energy that worried Ethan. Robert was 65, and his hip had been bothering him all week. Dad, slow down! Ethan yelled over the thunder that shook the floorboards. We have time. The wind is picking up, Ethan. I need to get that loose shutter before it blows through the glass, Robert shouted back from the hallway. And then the lights went out. It wasn't a flicker. It was a sudden, absolute plunging into blackness. The hum of the refrigerator died. The TV cut off. The only sound was the screaming wind and the terrifying, relentless drumming of the rain. "Flashlights!" Ethan barked. He grabbed the heavy-duty tactical light he had staged on his lap. He clicked it on, the beam cutting through the dark, illuminating dust and anxious dog eyes. "Dad?" Ethan called out. "Stay where you are. I'm coming to you." Boom! A sound like a bomb detonation tore through the night. It didn't come from the sky. It came from the earth. The entire house lurched forward a few inches. Pictures fell from the walls, shattering glass across the floor. Ethan grabbed his wheels to keep from tipping over. Ranger barked, a sharp, warning sound. "Dad!" Ethan screamed. "I'm here!" Robert's voice came from the direction of the kitchen, near the door to the garage and basement. "It's the hill! The mud hit the garage!" "Get back to the living room!" Ethan yelled, spinning his chair around. "I have to check the breaker. If the water hits the main line—" "No! Leave it!" But Robert, driven by the stubborn instinct of a homeowner trying to save his castle, didn't listen. Ethan saw the beam of his father's smaller flashlight bobbing toward the door that led to the garage stairs. "Dad, stop!" Ethan pushed his wheels hard, the rubber burning against his palms. Ranger was already ahead of him, sprinting toward Robert, barking frantically to herd him back, but they were too late. A second impact hit the house. This one was softer, a wet, heavy slap, but the vibration was violent. The mudslide had breached the garage wall. The door frame where Robert stood twisted. The floor beneath him buckled. "Robert!" Ethan screamed. Robert lost his footing. The flashlight spun wildly in the air, creating a dizzying strobe effect. There was a sickening sound of wood splintering and a heavy thud, followed by the clatter of a body tumbling down wooden stairs. Then, silence. "Dad!" Ethan reached the top of the landing, his wheelchair skidding to a halt. He shone his light down into the abyss of the basement stairwell. The beam cut through the dust. At the bottom of the stairs, lying in a heap of old cardboard boxes and holiday decorations, was Robert. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle beneath him. His eyes were closed. He wasn't moving. Water, thick, brown, muddy water, was beginning to trickle down the stairs from the breached garage door, pooling around Robert's head. Ethan stared down. The stairs were steep, narrow, and blocked by debris. His wheelchair couldn't go down there. He was trapped at the top. His father was dying at the bottom. Ranger stood at the top of the stairs, looking down, then looking back at Ethan. He whined, a high-pitched sound of distress. "Ranger," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. "Dad, he's—" "Check him." Ranger didn't need to be told twice. He navigated the debris-strewn stairs with agility, hopping over a broken banister rail. He reached Robert and sniffed his face. He looked back up at Ethan and gave a single, sharp bark. Alive. But the water was rising, and the mud was coming. Ethan gripped the armrests of his chair. He looked at his stumps. He looked at the stairs. "Okay," Ethan said to the empty, dark house. "Okay." He unbuckled the safety strap across his waist. The top of the stairs was a cliff edge. Beyond it lay a dark, jagged canyon filled with the debris of a broken home and the rising tide of the earth itself. Ethan Vance sat in his wheelchair, gripping the rims until his knuckles turned white. The beam of his tactical flashlight cut through the dust, illuminating the nightmare below. The basement, usually a sanctuary of old tools and holiday ornaments, was transforming into a tomb. The mudslide had punched through the garage wall like a titan's fist, and a slurry of brown sludge and rainwater was pouring in, swirling around the motionless body of Robert Vance. The water was already inches deep. It lapped at Robert's gray hair. "Dad!" Ethan screamed again, but the only answer was the groan of the house settling deeper into the shifting hillside. Ethan looked at his wheelchair. For 3 years, this titanium frame had been his world. It was his safety, his mobility, his prison. But looking at the narrow, debris-choked staircase, he realized with a sickening clarity that the chair was useless here. It was too wide, too rigid. If he tried to roll down, he would tumble, break his neck, and they would both die in the dark. He had to leave it. The realization hit him like a physical blow. To leave the chair was to become helpless. It was to return to the state he hated most, crawling, dragging, broken. It was an admission that he was half a man. "I can't," Ethan whispered, his voice cracking. The panic flared in his chest, hot and suffocating. The PTSD whispered that he was back in the desert, pinned down, unable to move. Then, a wet nose shoved hard against his bicep. Ranger was there. The dog hadn't gone down to stay with Robert. He had come back up. He stood between Ethan and the stairs, vibrating with intensity. He didn't whine. He let out a low, guttural growl, not of aggression, but of demand. Move. Fight. Ethan looked into those amber eyes. They weren't pitying. They were expectant. Ranger didn't see a cripple. He saw a squad leader who was wasting time. "You're right," Ethan gritted out, the shame burning away into resolve. "We don't leave men behind." Ethan unbuckled the strap across his waist. He locked the brakes on the chair. Then, taking a deep breath that tasted of wet drywall and fear, he placed his hands on the floorboards. He pushed off. He hit the floor with a heavy thud. The impact jarred his spine, but he didn't stop. He dragged his body to the lip of the stairs. The view was terrifying. The stairs were steep, and the wood was slick with water that had dripped from the ceiling. Splintered pieces of the banister lay across the steps like caltrops. Ethan looked at Ranger. "I need you, buddy." "Field ops." Ranger understood. He didn't run down the stairs. Instead, he turned around, presenting his rear to the drop. He lowered his center of gravity, digging his claws into the carpet runner. He was waiting. Ethan reached out and grabbed the first step with his hand. He lowered his body, his triceps screaming as they took his full weight. He swung his hips down, his stumps hitting the wood hard. Pain shot up his thighs. It was sharp and blinding, a reminder of the nerves that were still tangled and raw at the scarred ends of his limbs. Ethan gasped, squeezing his eyes shut. He slipped. His hand lost traction on the wet wood. His body lurched forward, gravity grabbing him, threatening to send him tumbling headfirst into the darkness. "Ranger!" The dog moved instantly. Ranger backed down 2 steps and slammed his heavy body against Ethan's chest. He became a living brake. The impact knocked the wind out of Ethan, but it stopped the fall. Ethan lay there for a second, his face buried in Ranger's wet fur. He could feel the dog's heart hammering against his own ribs. Ranger's hind legs were trembling with the strain of holding them both on the slick incline, but he didn't budge. He growled softly, a rumble that vibrated through Ethan's chest. "I've got you. Keep moving." "Okay," Ethan panted, spitting out fur. "Okay, brace." Ranger stiffened, locking his legs. Ethan reached out, grabbing a handful of Ranger's thick scruff with one hand and the remains of the banister railing with the other. 1, Ethan counted. He dragged himself down to the next step. 2. Ranger mirrored him. As soon as Ethan was stable, Ranger would gingerly take 1 step down, backward, checking his footing, then brace again. It was a dance of desperate trust. A 4-legged creature doing something completely unnatural, walking blindly backward into danger, because his human needed him to. The descent was a blur of agony and grit. Step 6. Ethan's hoodie snagged on a nail, tearing open. Step 8. His flashlight rolled away, clattering down to the bottom, the beam spinning wildly before coming to rest on Robert's pale face. Step 10. The water was getting louder. The smell of the mud was overpowering now, the earthy scent of a grave. "Almost there," Ethan rasped. His arms were burning with lactic acid. His stumps felt like they were on fire. He was shivering, soaked in sweat and rain that dripped from the ceiling, but he wasn't helpless. He was moving. He was a Marine. He was adapting. At the 12th step, the debris was thick. A piece of the garage door frame blocked the path. Ethan tried to shove it, but it was wedged tight. "Damn it," he cursed. He looked at Ranger. The dog was panting heavily, his eyes wide in the gloom. "Over," Ethan commanded. Ranger leaped over the debris, landing in the rising water at the bottom of the stairs with a splash. He turned around instantly, putting his front paws on the bottom step, looking up at Ethan. Ethan didn't have legs to jump. He had to slide. He positioned himself on the edge of the blockage. It was a 3-foot drop to the basement floor. "Catch me," Ethan whispered to the darkness. He pushed off. He landed hard, not on the concrete, but in the freezing, thick slurry of mud and water. It splashed over his head, filling his mouth with grit. He flailed for a moment, the cold shock seizing his muscles. Strong teeth clamped onto the back of his hoodie. Ranger pulled, dragging Ethan's head up out of the muck. Ethan sputtered, coughing up water, and scrambled to prop himself up on his elbows. He was down. He was in the underworld. "Dad!" Ethan army crawled through the sludge. The water was higher here than it had looked from above. It was halfway up the wheels of the old bicycle stored against the wall. He reached Robert. His father was lying half submerged. The water was dangerously close to his nose and mouth. "Dad, wake up!" Ethan grabbed Robert's collar and hauled him up, propping his head onto his lap. Robert groaned, his eyelids fluttering. His face was gray, a stark contrast to the dark mud smudged on his forehead. "Ethan," he mumbled, his voice slurred. "Leg. My leg." "I've got you," Ethan said, wiping the mud from his father's face. "I'm here." Robert cracked his eyes open. In the erratic light of the fallen flashlight, he saw his son. Ethan was covered in mud, his clothes torn, sitting in freezing water with no wheelchair in sight. But he wasn't small. He looked massive. His shoulders were squared, his eyes fierce. "You came down," Robert whispered, a tear tracking through the dirt on his cheek, "without the chair." "Ranger brought me," Ethan said, nodding to the dog who was now standing guard over them, licking Robert's hand frantically. An ominous creak echoed from above. A trickle of dirt fell from the ceiling, landing in the water with a plop. Ethan looked up. The garage door above the stairs was bowing inward. The hillside was still moving. The mud wasn't just rising, it was pressing. If that door gave way completely, the entire basement would be filled with tons of earth in seconds. They weren't safe yet. They were trapped in a slowly collapsing box. Ethan looked around the basement. The stairs were blocked by the debris he had just jumped over. He couldn't drag a 200-pound man back up those stairs, not without his legs, not with the blockage. "We can't go back up," Ethan said, his mind racing through tactical options. He looked at the small ventilation window high up on the far wall. It was small, rectangular, and ground level with the backyard. "Too high," Ethan muttered. "I can't lift you there." Then his eyes landed on the old storm cellar doors on the south wall. They were metal, rusted shut from years of disuse, leading out to the side yard, but the mudslide had hit the north wall. The south side might still be clear. "The storm doors," Ethan said. He looked at Ranger. "We have to breach." He looked back at his father. Robert was drifting out of consciousness again, the pain in his leg overwhelming him. "Stay with me, Dad," Ethan commanded, his voice finding that steel core of the sergeant he used to be. "The mission isn't over. We're moving out." Ethan grabbed Robert under the arms. "Ranger, front!" Ranger splashed to the front, grabbing Robert's sleeve gently but firmly. "Pull!" Together, man and dog, they began to drag the injured patriarch through the rising mud, inch by agonizing inch, toward the rusted doors that were their only hope of salvation. The basement was no longer a room, it was a sinking vessel. Ethan Vance strained against the rusted handle of the storm cellar doors, the muscles in his arms screaming with exertion. He pushed until black spots danced in his vision, but the metal didn't budge. The mudslide hadn't just hit the garage. It had poured over the side yard, burying the external exit under tons of wet, heavy earth. They were sealed in. Ethan slumped back into the muck, the freezing water now lapping at his waist. Beside him, Robert Vance let out a low, ragged moan. The older man's face was ashen, his lips turning blue from the cold. The water was rising steadily, fed by the breach in the garage and the broken pipes in the walls. It was a dark, churning soup of oil, dirt, and freezing rain. "Dad," Ethan said, shaking Robert's shoulder gently. "Stay with me. Don't you dare close your eyes." "Cold," Robert whispered, his teeth chattering violently. "So cold." Ethan looked around the trap. The stairs were blocked. The storm doors were buried. The air in the basement was growing heavy with the smell of natural gas and wet rot. The house above them groaned again, a terrifying sound of timber snapping under extreme pressure. Time was not just running out, it was gone. Ethan's eyes frantically scanned the ceiling line. There, high up on the east wall, was the ventilation window. It was small, barely 18 inches wide, and covered by a flimsy wire mesh. It was level with the backyard ground, likely the only opening not yet submerged by the slide, but it was 5 feet off the ground. Ethan looked at his stumps. He looked at his unconscious father. There was no way he could lift a 200-pound man up there. He couldn't even lift himself. But there was one soldier who could make the climb. "Ranger!" Ethan called out. The German shepherd was paddling in the deeper water near the washing machine, keeping his head high, his eyes locked on Ethan. At the command, he swam over, his paws splashing in the sludge. Ethan grabbed Ranger's collar, pulling him close. The dog was shivering, coated in mud, but his spirit was unbroken. He licked the dirt from Ethan's face, a frantic gesture of comfort. "I need you to listen," Ethan said, his voice cracking. He pressed his forehead against the dog's wet snout. "We can't get out, but you can." Ranger whined, pressing his body against Ethan's chest. He understood the tone. It was a goodbye. "No," Ethan said firmly, suppressing the sob that threatened to choke him. "Not goodbye, a mission. You have to get help. Find help." Ethan maneuvered himself under the window. The water gave him some buoyancy. "Up," Ethan commanded, patting his own shoulder. Ranger hesitated. He looked at Robert, then back at Ethan. His instinct was to stay, to guard, to die beside his pack if necessary. That was the loyalty of his bloodline. "Ranger!" Ethan's voice shifted. It wasn't the voice of a friend anymore. It was the voice of a squad leader. It was steel and fire. "You have your orders. Up!" The military discipline kicked in. Ranger scrambled onto Ethan's shoulders, his claws digging into the fabric of the ruined hoodie. Ethan gritted his teeth against the pain, bracing himself against the wall, becoming a human ladder. "Go!" Ethan roared, shoving upward with all his remaining strength. Ranger lunged. He caught the sill of the window with his front paws. He scrambled, his back legs kicking for purchase against the concrete wall, until he squeezed his body into the narrow recess. He pushed against the wire mesh with his nose. It was old and rusted. With a sharp shove, the mesh gave way. Ranger looked back one last time. From his vantage point, he looked down into the dark, watery tomb where his humans were trapped. "Go!" Ethan screamed, tears mixing with the mud on his face. "Get help! Go!" Ranger turned and vanished into the storm. The world outside was a cacophony of violence. The wind howled through the Douglas firs like a banshee, and the rain fell in sheets so thick it felt like being underwater. Ranger emerged from the vent, scrambling into the muddy grass of the backyard. The house looked wrong. It was tilted, half swallowed by the hillside that had given way. He barked, a sharp sound that was instantly swallowed by the wind. He ran to the front of the house, but the street was empty. The power lines were down, sparking in the puddles like angry snakes. Ranger spun in a circle, his nose working overtime, trying to find a scent of humanity. But the rain washed everything away. He ran. He sprinted down the driveway, his paws slipping on the wet asphalt. He reached the main road, Highland Drive, which wound down the hill toward the city. It was pitch black, the streetlights dead. Ranger ran down the center line. He was exhausted. He was hungry. His leg ached from the climb. But the image of the man in the water drove him forward. Then he saw them, twin beams of light cutting through the deluge. A quarter-mile down the road, a heavy vehicle was crawling up the hill. It was a Humvee, its engine roaring against the incline, painted in the drab olive of the National Guard. Inside the vehicle, Specialist Kowalski, a 20-year-old kid from Tacoma, with a grip of iron on the steering wheel, was squinting through the rain-slicked windshield. "I can't see a thing, Sarge," Kowalski shouted over the engine and the storm. "The road is washing out. We should turn back." In the passenger seat sat Sergeant Hutch Hutchinson. Hutch was 50, a career soldier with gray stubble and eyes that had seen too many disasters. He was chewing on an unlit cigar, studying a topographic map with a red flashlight. "We have reports of trapped civilians in the upper sector," Hutch grunted. "Push on, Kowalski. Just keep it between the ditches." "Sarge, look out!" Kowalski slammed on the brakes. The Humvee skidded on the wet leaves, fishtailing slightly before coming to a halt. Standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by the blinding headlights, was a creature that looked more like a muddy demon than a dog. It was barking, ferociously, relentlessly, directly at the 3-ton military vehicle. "Crazy mutt," Kowalski breathed, reaching for the horn. "Get out of the way." "Belay that," Hutch ordered sharply. He leaned forward, squinting. Ranger didn't flinch at the high beams. He barked 3 times, sharp, rhythmic, piercing barks. Then he turned and sprinted 20 yards up the hill, back the way he came. He stopped. He looked back at the Humvee. He barked again. Then he ran back to the bumper of the truck, looked Hutch in the eye through the glass, barked, and sprinted away again. "What is he doing?" Kowalski asked, confused. "Is he rabid?" Hutch's eyes widened. He opened the heavy door and stepped out onto the running board, the rain instantly soaking him. "That's not a stray," Hutch shouted. "That's a bark and alert. That's a search and rescue pattern. He's telling us to follow. Ranger saw the man step out. He let out a howl that sounded like a siren, then took off running up the hill, pausing every few seconds to make sure the metal beast was following. "Drive!" Hutch yelled, jumping back in. "Follow that dog." "Are you serious, Sarge?" "I said drive, specialist. That dog is leading us to a target." Ethan was losing the battle. The water was at his chest now. He was holding Robert's head up with his arms, but his strength was failing. The cold had seeped into his bones, making his movements sluggish. The air in the basement was running out as the water rose toward the ceiling. "I'm sorry, Dad," Ethan whispered into the dark. "I tried." He closed his eyes, resting his cheek against his father's wet hair. He thought of the desert. He thought of Gunner. At least, he thought, he wouldn't be alone this time. Thump. A heavy vibration shook the ceiling. Then another. Thump, thump, boots. Heavy boots on the floorboards above. "Hello? Anyone down there?" The voice was muffled, coming from the ventilation vent. Ethan's eyes snapped open. He tried to shout, but his voice was a croak. He slapped the water with his hand. "Here! We're here!" "I hear splashing," a voice shouted from outside. "Over here! Bring the K-12 saw!" A blinding beam of light cut through the vent, illuminating the rising black water. "Hang on!" the voice yelled. "We're coming in!" The sound of a gas-powered saw roared to life, a beautiful, mechanical scream. Sparks flew as the blade cut through the concrete foundation and the wood framing of the window. Seconds later, the wall crumbled inward. Strong hands reached through the widened hole. "I've got a visual!" Hutch yelled, his face appearing in the opening. "2 victims! Water level critical!" "Take him first," Ethan rasped, pushing his father toward the hands. "He's hurt!" It took 3 men to haul Robert out of the muck and through the widened window. As soon as his father was clear, Ethan felt his own adrenaline crash. He started to slip under the water. "Grab my hand, Marine!" Hutch roared, leaning dangerously far into the hole. Ethan reached up. Hutch grabbed his forearm with a grip like a vice. "I've got you," Hutch grunted, pulling. "Heave!" Ethan was dragged from the freezing darkness, scraping over the jagged concrete, and pulled out into the wet grass of the backyard. He collapsed in the mud, gasping for air, the rain feeling like a blessing on his face. He rolled onto his back, coughing up water. A medic was already working on Robert a few feet away. "He's got a pulse. Weak, but he's alive." Ethan let his head fall back against the grass. He was alive. His dad was alive. Then, a heavy weight landed on his chest. It wasn't mud. It was warm. It was frantically licking his face, whining, nuzzling his neck. Ethan opened his eyes. Ranger was standing over him, shivering, his tail waging so hard it was shaking his entire body. Ethan wrapped his arms around the dog's neck, pulling him down into a crushing embrace. He buried his face in the wet, muddy fur and sobbed, great heaving sobs of relief and love. "That's one hell of a dog you got there, son," Hutch said, standing over them, wiping rain from his eyes. "He blocked our truck, wouldn't let us pass until we followed him. Proper canine procedure, textbook execution." Ethan looked up at the sergeant. He looked at Ranger, the dog who had been discarded, beaten and stolen, but who had just saved their world. "He's not a dog," Ethan whispered, looking into Ranger's amber eyes. "He's my partner." The Seattle spring had arrived with a vengeance, but this time, it brought color instead of gray. The rhododendrons in the front yard of the Vance home were exploding in shades of violent pink and purple, and the new grass in the backyard was a lush, vibrant emerald. The house itself bore no scars from the night the earth had tried to swallow it. The garage had been rebuilt, stronger this time, with reinforced concrete retaining walls that looked like they could withstand a tank assault. The mud was gone, replaced by fresh landscaping, but the biggest change wasn't in the architecture, it was in the air. The heavy silence that had once filled the hallways was gone, replaced by the sound of a radio playing classic rock in the kitchen and the click-clack of dog claws on the new hardwood floors. Robert Vance stood in front of the hallway mirror, adjusting his tie. His leg had healed well, though he still favored it slightly when the weather turned damp. He looked at his reflection. The lines of worry that had etched his face for 3 years had softened. He looked younger, lighter. "We're going to be late, son," Robert called out, checking his watch. "The mayor doesn't like to wait." "I'm coming," a voice replied from the bedroom. "Just give me a minute." Robert smiled, a mixture of pride and heartache swelling in his chest. "Take your time. We've got time." The grand ballroom of Seattle City Hall was packed. It wasn't just a local interest story anymore. The miracle in the mud had gone viral. People loved a hero, but they loved a dog even more. The room buzzed with the low murmur of anticipation. Reporters adjusted their cameras in the back. In the front row, a reserved section was filled with familiar faces. Dr. Sarah Jenkins sat on the end, wearing a dress instead of scrubs, dabbing her eyes with a tissue before the ceremony had even started. Next to her sat Sergeant Hutch, looking uncomfortable in his formal Class A uniform, his polished boots gleaming under the chandeliers. Specialist Kowalski sat beside him, looking significantly more respectful than he had in the Humvee 6 months ago. And right in the center of the front row, there was a reserved spot. It was occupied by a wheelchair. The chair was polished, its titanium frame shining. But the seat was empty. A hush fell over the room as the lights dimmed. The mayor stepped up to the podium, adjusting the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," the mayor began, his voice echoing through the hall, "we are here today to honor courage. Not the courage of a moment, but the courage of a lifetime. We are here to honor a bond that survived war, disaster, and despair." He gestured to the heavy velvet curtains at the side of the stage. "Please welcome Sergeant Ethan Vance and his partner, Ranger." The curtains parted. The room held its breath. Ethan Vance stepped into the light. He was wearing his Marine Corps dress blues. The high collar was buttoned tight, the gold buttons gleaming, the blood stripe running down the side of his trousers like a vein of fire. His chest was adorned with ribbons from a war that had taken so much from him. But no one was looking at his medals. They were looking at his walk. Clack, clack, clack. The sound was distinct, the rhythmic strike of carbon fiber and rubber against the wooden stage floor. Ethan wasn't gliding. He wasn't walking with the effortless grace of a man born with legs. He was fighting for every step. Sweat beaded on his forehead, glistening under the stage lights. His jaw was set in a line of intense concentration. His gait was slightly uneven, a mechanical lurch that betrayed the immense physical effort required to balance on metal limbs after 3 years of sitting. Every step was a battle. Every step was a victory. And he wasn't doing it alone. Ranger was right beside him. The German Shepherd looked magnificent. His coat, once dull and patchy, shone like burnished copper and obsidian. He wore a specialized service vest with the American flag embroidered on the side. Ranger wasn't just walking, he was spotting. His shoulder was pressed firmly against Ethan's left thigh. When Ethan wobbled slightly on his third step, Ranger immediately leaned in, applying counterpressure, stabilizing his human without breaking stride. They moved as one organism, a synthesis of man and beast, metal and muscle. The crowd stood up. It started as a ripple and turned into a wave. A thunderous ovation washed over the stage. Men wiped their eyes. Women clutched their hands to their hearts. Robert Vance, standing in the wings of the stage, wept openly, watching his son walk tall for the first time since he had boarded a plane to Afghanistan. Ethan reached the podium. He gripped the sides of it with white-knuckled hands, using it to offload some of the weight from his aching stumps. He waited for the applause to die down, his chest heaving slightly from the exertion. He looked out at the crowd. He saw Hutch, who gave him a sharp, slow salute. He saw his father. Then he looked down at Ranger, who sat perfectly at attention by his side, looking up at Ethan with absolute adoration. Ethan leaned into the microphone. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady, though his hands trembled. I know a lot of you are looking at my legs." He paused, looking down at the prosthetics. "For 3 years, these legs sat in a closet," Ethan continued. "I hated them. I hated them because they hurt, they chafe, they blister, they are heavy. Putting them on means admitting that the real ones are gone forever. Putting them on means accepting pain." He reached down and rested his hand on Ranger's head. The dog leaned into the touch, closing his eyes. "I wanted to stay in the chair. It was comfortable, it was safe. But 6 months ago, I learned that safe doesn't save you. When the water rose, when my father was dying, the chair couldn't help me. Comfort couldn't help me." Ethan took a deep breath, his eyes locking with his father's across the stage. "My partner here, he didn't care about comfort. He crawled through mud. He broke out of a cage. He ran until his paws bled to save us. He taught me something that I had forgotten in the hospital." Ethan's voice grew stronger, projecting to the back of the room. "He taught me that you don't stand up because it's easy. You stand up because someone needs you to. You accept the pain, you accept the scars, and you walk through the fire because that is what love requires. He looked at Ranger again. This medal is for him. But these legs, Ethan tapped his prosthetic thigh. These are for my dad, and for anyone else who thinks their life is over because they're broken. You can walk again. You just need the right partner to help you find your balance. Ethan stepped back. The mayor stepped forward, draping a heavy medal around Ranger's neck. The dog didn't flinch. He just wagged his tail, happy to be the center of his pack's attention. Epilogue: the sun was setting over the Puget Sound, painting the sky in streaks of violet and gold. The air was crisp, smelling of salt water and pine. On a piece of property just outside the city limits, a new sign hung over a freshly paved driveway. It was hand-carved from cedar, the letters burnt into the wood. Vance and Ranger Legacy Center Service Dog, training for wounded veterans. In the large, fenced-in training yard, a group of 5 veterans stood in a semicircle. Some were missing arms, one was in a wheelchair, another had the distant, haunted look of severe PTSD. At their feet sat 5 young dogs, golden retrievers, labs, and one spunky German shepherd mix. Ethan stood in the center of the ring. He was leaning on a cane, but he was standing. Ranger was sitting beside him, demonstrating a perfect stay. "All right, listen up," Ethan called out, his voice carrying the natural authority of a leader. "The dog at your feet isn't a pet. He isn't a tool. He is your mirror. If you are anxious, he will be anxious. If you are calm, he will be calm. You have to heal yourselves to lead them." Ethan walked down the line, correcting a leash hold here, adjusting a collar there. He stopped in front of a young woman who was staring at her boots, tears silently tracking down her face. Her dog, a black lab, was whining, confused by her distress. "Hey," Ethan said softly. The woman looked up. "I can't do this, Sergeant. I'm too broken." Ethan smiled. It was a genuine smile, one that reached his eyes. "We're all broken, Marine," Ethan said. "That's how the light gets in." He whistled. Ranger trotted over and gently nudged the woman's hand with his wet nose. The woman froze, then slowly, her fingers curled into the dog's fur. A small, tentative smile broke through her tears. Ethan looked over at the porch of the main building. Robert was sitting in a rocking chair, a glass of iced tea in his hand, watching the training session with a look of profound peace. He raised his glass to his son. Ethan nodded back. He looked at the veterans, at the dogs, at the life he had built from the wreckage of his past. He looked down at his prosthetic legs. They still hurt. They would always hurt, a little. But as he watched Ranger run across the grass to greet a new puppy, Ethan realized he didn't mind the pain anymore. It was just the feeling of being alive. Ethan and Ranger's journey reminds us of a powerful truth. Being broken is not the end of your story. It is simply the beginning of a new chapter. True strength is not about hiding your pain or pretending you are invincible. True strength is the courage to accept help, to lean on those who love you, and to stand up again, even when your legs are shaking. Just like Ethan, we all face storms that threaten to bury us. We all have scars that we try to hide. But God often sends us miracles in unexpected forms, sometimes as a stranger, sometimes as a friend, and sometimes as a dog with muddy paws and a loyal heart. Never be afraid to let the light back in. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button and share it with a friend or family member who might need a reminder that they are never truly alone. And if you want to hear more stories about the unbreakable bond between humans and animals, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. I pray that whatever storm you are facing in your life right now, God grants you the resilience of a Marine and the faithful heart of a guardian. May He give you the strength to stand up when you feel like falling, and may He surround you with love that heals your wounds. If you believe in the power of healing and hope, please write Amen in the comments below. God bless you.